Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us today for our press briefing on the Common Fisheries Policy and the future perspectives on the Common Fisheries Policy. If people could please mute themselves just for now until we get started. We'll just wait a couple more minutes because we have a number of more people registered for the press briefing. So we'll start in a minute or two. But maybe I'll just start with an introduction. I'm Rebecca Hubbard, the Program Director for Our Fish, and we are today hosting this press briefing with our colleagues at Oceana, Seas at Risk, WWF, Client Earth, BirdLife, and of course, Our Fish. And we will have the format of the briefing will be 2 presentations to begin with, and then a Q&A section. It's a fairly short briefing. The idea is to give you maximum expert information and some food for thought. And then, of course, you can ask further questions and or take that information going forward in your reporting this week on issues around this week and beyond. On reporting on the Common Fisheries Policy. So in terms of the format, thanks again for joining. We still have a couple of people coming in, so that's why I'm just doing a very long introduction. You can turn your cameras on and say hello, and we really would like to make it as personal as possible. So during the Q&A, you can write your question in the chat if you like, but we really welcome you to put your hand up and turn your camera on and ask the question yourself. If you could mute until you want to speak, that would be great, just to keep the interference to a minimum. So today's press briefing, I'll get started, and there is a recording as well for anyone who misses any of it. So today's press briefing is on future perspectives of the Common Fisheries Policy. So the Common Fisheries Policy, as most of you know, is the EU law that really manages and sets the objectives for EU fisheries management or fisheries management in the EU and by EU member states. And the latest reform of the Common Fisheries Policy came into effect on the 1st of January in 2014. And in this reform of the CFP, as it is familiarly known, there is an article 49, which specifically says that the Commission shall report to the European Parliament and Council on the functioning of the Common Fisheries Policy by the 31st of December 2022. So it is this legal requirement for the Commission to report on the functioning of the CFP, which is what has prompted this briefing today, and what is following. So later this week on the 17th, the PESH committee will be holding a public hearing on the state of play in the implementation of the Common Fisheries Policy and future perspectives on the Common Fisheries Policy. They have organised this hearing to inform a PESH own initiative report, which they'll be preparing on the implementation of the Common Fisheries Policy. And it's not 100% clear to me if their own initiative report is to influence the Commission's report, since the Commission's report is intended to go to the European Parliament. But perhaps that's a question for them. And just to also say that the Commission has started its consultation on the functioning of the CFP, which opened in the 17th of December and is closing today, actually, their targeted consultation, but they are also doing a number of other consultations with advisory councils and other stakeholders. So essentially today's press briefing is for the NGOs to give journalists information on what we see as key issues around the functioning of the Common Fisheries Policy, what our joint perspective is on how it's going and what we'd like to see in terms of future perspectives. And also perhaps to give you a few ideas or heads up about some of the issues which we think will come up in the PESH hearing later this week. So as I said before, what we're going to do is we'll first hear from Vera Coelho from Oceana on the NGOs' perspectives, and then we'll also hear from Andrea Rippel from Seas at Risk on some of the potential issues that we might see come up and that we have seen come up from the PESH committee in recent times. And then that should take about 15 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A. So if you have questions as they come up, you can either write them in the chat or we'll just have a Q&A at the end. And as I said before, you can turn your video on and we can have more of a conversation if you like. So without further ado, I will hand over to Vera. Thanks, Vera.
Thank you, Beck. Let me share my screen. Can you see it? Yeah, all right. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you everybody for coming today. My name is Vera Coelho. I am the Senior Director Advocacy at Oceana in Europe. I'll jump straight into the presentation. I'll be happy to answer questions then afterwards. All right, so before going specifically into the details of the CFP's objectives and tools and all that has happened, I would like to take a step back and recall the ambition of the CFP reform in 2013 that Beck mentioned. So before the reform, overfishing in Europe was rampant. Fleet profitability was very low, and the resilience of the sector to external shocks, such as the 2008 fuel price crisis, which we are somewhat reliving these days, was also extremely low. So against this background, the CFP reform was presented as a root and branch reform aimed at overhauling the policy in order to rebuild fisheries abundance as the condition sine qua non for a profitable fishing sector and resilient coastal communities. And this fundamental change in approach had huge public support, and it was also heavily supported by the European Parliament, who ensured that, in fact, there was this ecosystem-based approach at the heart of the new policy framework, and that the ambition to rebuild all commercially exploited stocks above levels capable of producing maximum sustainable yield was written into the law as a key objective. So if we want to summarize the key strengths of the current CFP, the ones I would highlight are the following. The CFP recognizes that a healthy marine environment is not just a mere pillar of sustainability that you can balance against socioeconomic considerations, but instead environmental sustainability and in particular healthy and abundant fish stocks are the necessary basis upon which socioeconomic sustainability relies. As such, restoring fish populations to abundant levels is a central objective of the policy because it is the key to this robust and profitable fishing sector in the long term. And in order to rebuild stocks, the CFP set a legally binding deadline to end overfishing for all stocks. It also recognized that fishing has a number of wider impacts on marine ecosystems, including bycatch of commercial as well as of sensitive species. And it tried to address the political nature of setting fishing limits and also the need for long-term, ecosystem-based, region-specific fisheries management through multi-annual plans. So this was the high ambition that resulted from the reform at the end of 2013. Now that we are more than 8 years later, what has the CFP actually achieved? Well, it's clear that the legally binding requirement to end overfishing, with an initial deadline of 2015 and an ultimate deadline of 2020, which was consistent with the deadlines under the United Nations, was absolutely crucial in driving a reduction in overfishing in the Northeast Atlantic. Indeed, we see that most stocks with MSY assessments nowadays have fishing limits in line with MSY advice. In the Mediterranean, however, where fisheries are managed through effort restrictions instead of fishing limits, we do not see much change, and the vast majority of assessed stocks continues to be overfished. We also know that this decrease in overfishing has led to an increase in biomass, but the European Commission does not ask ICES to provide BMSY estimates. So in fact, we simply do not know how near or how far we are from the objective to restore all stocks above BMSY. Nevertheless, this increase in biomass is one of the main factors that led to the increase in the average profitability of the fleet since the reform, with gross and net profits hitting record levels just before the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And again, contrast this with the situation before the reform, when on average, the fleet was only marginally profitable. But the ambition of the reform is not yet fully realized. While the CFP provides a sound and ambitious framework, implementation, control, enforcement have been clearly insufficient. There are many examples that I could mention, but for the sake of time, I will just select a few. So despite the legally binding deadline to achieve the FMSY exploitation rate by 2015 where possible, and by 2020 at the very latest for all stocks, the European Commission has continued to propose, and the Council has continued to adopt fishing limits that exceed the best available scientific advice. And while this has been decreasing for stocks that have MSY-based advice, it must be noted that a vast number of stocks do not have MSY-based advice. And in these instances where we have less knowledge, management should actually be even more cautious. But year after year, and even after the 2020 deadline, we see that the Council has used the lack of MSY advice to continue setting multiple TACs in excess of scientifically advised levels. Furthermore, even some stocks that do have MSY-based advice continue to be overfished because they have been so overexploited that the scientific advice is now for zero catches. Because rather than taking action to rebuild their abundance between 2014 and 2020, member states have continued to overfish these stocks. And on top of this, the Council has repeatedly adopted quota top-ups to account for the landing obligation, while in fact, the widespread lack of compliance with the landing obligation is well known, again, leading to overfishing. One approach that would have helped with the implementation of the CFP's requirements was regionalization. During the reform, it was recognized that there should be EU-wide management objectives, such as ending overfishing, gradually eliminating discards, or minimizing impacts on marine ecosystems, but that achieving these objectives would probably need different measures in different regions. But regionalization was not implemented in this way. On the contrary, each of the multi-annual management plans that have been adopted so far have introduced provisions that weaken the objectives of the CFP. Moreover, the multi-annual plans themselves don't contain measures that are particularly adapted to that ecosystem or fishery. They simply create a process for member states to come to an agreement at regional level on management measures. And this process has been primarily used to adopt measures to implement the landing obligation, but in practice, meaning mostly adopting exemptions to the landing obligation. This process has also been particularly unhelpful when it comes to adopting measures to address fisheries impacts on marine habitats and biodiversity. The European Court of Auditors has highlighted how the policy framework is all there. We have EU laws that require the protection of marine biodiversity, and we have articles in the CFP that say that fisheries management should contribute to this. But the CFP's tools, such as fish stock recovery areas or Article 11, are not being used at all, or they are being used by member states to simply stop the adoption of any meaningful fisheries management measures for nature conservation. So as such, member states continue to strive for the status quo, rather than using the tools available under the CFP to promote a transition to low impact fisheries. One final element that I would like to mention relates to climate change, which is the key challenge of our generation and also indissociable from the biodiversity crisis. Now, the word climate does not appear once in the CFP basic regulation, and climate considerations don't really feature so far in decisions about fisheries management. But the ocean has so far absorbed 90% of the excess heat that we have pumped into the atmosphere. And we know that marine life is essential to the ocean's ability to continue performing this buffering function. And we also know that fisheries both have an impact on and are impacted by climate change. So where does this leave us? The 2013 reform of the CFP resulted in a highly ambitious policy framework, which includes all the necessary tools to deliver on that ambition. But in the last 8 years, the EU has failed to fully seize upon those tools and implement the ambitions of the policy. So the EU now has a choice. We can go back to the drawing board and start thinking of a new reform, which would take years and generate a huge amount of instability, or we can make up for lost time and fully implement the provisions of the current CFP. It is our firm opinion that initiating a reform at this stage would be a mistake. If there are issues relating to implementation that need to be addressed, this can be done through revising other instruments, such as the multi-annual plans, to turn them into effective tools for delivering the ambition of the CFP, which at the moment they are not. Next week, also, the European Commission is going to propose a new nature restoration law, which is an opportunity to demand fisheries management measures that protect marine life and rebuild fish populations. And when it comes to climate, the European Commission is also currently preparing an action plan to conserve fisheries resources and protect marine ecosystems, which would be an opportunity to include a strong climate component, although the Commission doesn't seem very keen to do so. I would like to finish this presentation just by acknowledging and thanking also all my NGO colleagues. As Beck mentioned, we've been working on this together, and in the summer of last year, we jointly developed a position paper, which has been shared with the European Parliament's Fisheries Committee and with the European Commission as well, and which I have drawn upon heavily for this presentation. So our joint message in this paper is clear. The CFP remains a good legal framework for fisheries management, but lacks adequate implementation, control, and enforcement. Addressing these shortcomings is critical now, and certainly before any revision of the policy is considered. The necessary tools to address these implementation gaps already exist within the policy itself or in other current or upcoming regulations and policy initiatives. And now is not the time to start from scratch by launching yet another reform and a very lengthy legislative process, but to fulfill the existing commitments. In light of the climate and biodiversity crisis we find ourselves in, there is really no time to waste on paper exercises. And this is where I conclude. Thank you very much for your attention. Back to you, Beck.
Fantastic. Thanks, Vera. That was very comprehensive. It is quite, I mean, we can also provide that document to journalists as well that Vera mentioned. And it goes into those issues in a little bit more detail and a number of other issues as well. So, but I'll hand over now to Andrea, who will give a little bit of background on some of the issues which we've seen come up through the PESH committee and which might highlight a couple of issues that may be contentious in their upcoming approach to the implementation of the CFP. Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you, Beck, and thank you, Vera, for the presentation that is perfectly bridging with my short intervention. I'm going to share my screen first. Wait. this one. You see it?
Yep.
Okay.
Just put it into slideshow mode.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Okay, so yeah, I wanted to briefly highlight on my intervention how the scene and the picture that we have at the moment with the European Parliament, and in particular with the Fisheries Committee, is significantly different from what we had at the CFP reform, as Vera highlighted, and how this is very risky in all the discussion that is going to start now with the report that is happening in the European Parliament, but also with the whole revision of the Commission, because we can notice that the Fisheries Committee, the PESH Committee, usually is taking policies and positions that are biased towards industry positions. And to illustrate this, I wanted to show you a couple of recent examples that show us how the performance of the Fisheries Committee can be quite damaging for the whole ambition of the CFP implementation. And I want to start with a very recent example that took place in February this year, so just last month. And it had to do with a vote where it was, in principle, very straightforward procedure. It was consisting on a delegated act that the Commission was sending to the European Parliament as part of the process of the implementation of the European Maritime and Fisheries and Aquaculture Fund, MFAF, where the Commission was setting the criteria and the rules that were, let's say, making difficult that illegal fishers that commit serious infringements in a repeatedly way can access EU money. So that was the content of the delegated act, and the Parliament, and these criteria, these conditions were just agreed in the EMFF by all co-legislators just a few months before this delegated act was sent to the Fisheries Committee. So that's why I say it was in principle a straightforward vote. However, we got to know very close to the vote that there was a heavily lobbying performance happening behind the scenes by the fishing industry towards the Fisheries Committee. And we tried to warn the Fisheries Committee about the risks of rejecting this delegated act. And also we know the Commission was very concerned about this, because it's not only about the message and the content of the delegated act and the message that the MEPs would be sending to EU citizens, that actually EU taxpayers' money can be taken by illegal operators, but it was even an unlawful move, because this delegated act was based on an agreed and adopted regulation by the co-legislators. So despite all bets, the Fisheries Committee rejected this delegated act at the start, and here you can see from the roll call vote which MEPs were the ones that rejected this delegated act. And the problem is that this move, it didn't just get contained on the Fisheries Committee, but the problem is that this problem also spills over the whole European Parliament, because after this vote, as you know, it goes the plenary vote, and usually what happens is that MEPs in plenary trust those MEPs that are in the committees, because they have the technical knowledge, they have the more close look to what's being discussed and happening, so they tend to trust these MEPs. And this is what happened with this vote. And unfortunately, even if it was by a short margin, only 5 MEPs, which in plenary is not a lot. And that's also indicating that a big part of the Parliament was understanding that this was a really big mistake from the Parliament, but still the vote that took place in plenary was the same as in PESH, and this delegated act was rejected as European Parliament, which sets a precedent really dangerous precedent, and also is very self-explanatory in the sense that at the moment, the European Parliament is not really an institution that we can trust will advocate and approve legislation that is really watching out for the public good. But in this case, we can see how this is really following interests of the industry. And this is very sad and something to watch out for this whole discussion that is upcoming. And then a second example I wanted to show you is the also own initiative report that is happening that took place, in the Fisheries Committee about the landing obligation only in 2019. And it's no secret that the fishing industry really criticizes the landing obligation from the CFP and its implementation, and they want to get rid of it, and they ask for a revision of the Article 15, which is the landing obligation article, and this in practice means opening the CFP. So that's why I wanted also to bring this example, because this is going to be one of the main topics that will be polemic and will be used as a reason to revise potentially the CFP. And on this report, I wanted to show how the industry position in this case of revising the Article 15 was uptaken by numerous MEPs from the Fisheries Committee that submitted amendments to the original proposed draft report to revise the Article 15. And as a consequence, we know that that means opening the CFP. So that's why, this is I wanted to bring this example, because probably these are some of the reasons and arguments that are going to be used in the Fisheries Committee to put at risk the CFP. And in general, I wanted to use this presentation to get everyone aware of the risks that exist at the moment in the Fisheries Committee, but also, as we saw in the EMFF vote, in the whole European Parliament, of risking the debate going down the wrong road, and instead of focusing on the implementation that Vera explained, and the need to really make happen the ambition that was originally adopted with the reform of the CFP, there is an important risk that all this goes down the drain. So it's something to watch out in the coming weeks and debate. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. Some very clear examples there of PESH Committee's recent views. So if anybody would like to ask any questions, we have officially another 17 minutes, but we can stay longer if there's ongoing questions or discussion. But if you'd like to ask a question, you can just put your video on or raise your hand and take the floor. It can be any kind of question. I think a couple of people did join during the presentation. So if you have a question, then that's even a process-oriented question, if maybe you missed information at the beginning about the context of this briefing and related to the PESH Committee hearing and the report on the functioning of the CFP, just feel free to ask. Sophie, did you have a question?
Yes, sorry, I was trying to find a button to raise my hands. Here they are.
Totally fine, it worked.
Yes, I mean, it's the question I have regards the landing obligation, because about, it seems about everybody agrees that it's not working, whatever the sides. And the question, my question would be, how would you think that should be addressed? Because you can't go at it by little bits and pieces. So, you know, those making a point that there should be some sort of revision of that Article 15. So how do you see it? Because the tools you mentioned, you know, like the multi-annual management plan, I was also thinking about the multi-species approach somehow, you know, but how can you, do you have any suggestions, or can you see any moves of going at that without opening the door to all these potential abuses that you presented?
I think it's a really good question. So we actually have representatives from all of the NGOs who are part of our report as well, but I know that Andrea and Vera are both very informed about this issue. So Vera, would you like to respond to that?
Sure.
That question?
Yeah, I'll try. Hi, Sophie. I think the problem is, does anyone want the landing obligation, right? Because the landing obligation was introduced during the 2013 report for very clear reasons. On the one hand, because, you know, having bycatch at such enormous scales of some species was clearly unsustainable, putting those species at risk. It was perceived as extremely wasteful also by the European public. So there was a huge outcry and public support for getting rid of this harmful practice of discards. And the solution found in the political compromise was this landing obligation. And if you look at the CFP, the objective of the CFP is quite clear. It's a gradual elimination of discards, first of all, by minimizing unwanted catches in the first place, and then by making sure that any catches, wanted and unwanted, that remain, are landed, so that we know exactly how much was caught and that we can do something about it. And also, very importantly, to create an incentive to stop catching those unwanted catches, right? Because if you need to have space in your hold, spend time, etc., to bring this unwanted fish on land, that should incentivize the adoption of more selective fishing practices. What we've seen since the adoption of the CFP and of this groundbreaking decision to implement a landing obligation is that the intention then of, you know, the member states, certainly the industry as well, and parts of other EU institutions, was to revert to the status quo. So instead of putting in place this transition to more sustainable, more selective forms of fishing, what ensued was just the adoption of exemption after exemption after exemption to take all meaning away from the landing obligation, number one. Number two, no control and enforcement of the obligation to land all catches. We can see from the figures that it's not possible that the amounts that are being declared are indeed the amounts of bycatch that we see. So no control and enforcement. And thirdly, adoption of even higher fishing limits. So top-ups on annual tax and quotas to make up for the fact that now all these species are under the landing obligation. So what would reopening Article 15 do? If it would really result in a strengthening of the landing obligation, okay, but that is clearly not what is being sought here. So if we still agree as a society that we shouldn't be mindlessly killing animals and then throwing them back dead into the sea, if we agree that that's a wasteful, harmful practice that should not exist, then the only answer is to continue that transition to more selective, low impact fishing. And that could be done through incentives, through reviewing the multi-annual plans, through investment in more selective fishing practices, through incentivizing fishers to avoid unwanted catches, which they can do to a certain extent if they want to. unless and until that political will is there to send those signals, revising Article 15 will do nothing other than gut the landing obligation and make sure that it's even less effective than it has been so far.
I think that was a very clear answer. I mean, there's also the other tools such as quota swapping as well that are available and haven't been utilised as well. So there's certainly a lot of room for improved implementation if that's what they're seeking to do. So if you have any follow-up questions, Sophie, feel free to follow up.
No. I mean, I sometimes despair about the landing obligation and think that, but it's true that there are a few people and a few improvements noticeable. I mean, significant improvements in selectivity and so on. I think a lot has been messed up by the Brexit when you mentioned the quota swapping. And in those waters where it was systematic, there's been some friction there and it hasn't helped. I also find that without a proper multi-species, vision of some sorts, it's going to be difficult to, because all the reasons you mentioned, I mean, I totally agree. I also think that, with a proper landing obligation, then what people catch, which at the moment is a big problem in terms of the scientific advice and understanding of these multi-species fisheries, so, and I totally agree, it needs political will to stop the nonsense of the top-ups and, so essentially increasing fishing mortality in quite a few stocks, I think, that are now going down. Demersal stocks are now going down, which in my lifetime as a scientist, were safe, like the Saithe, or, we're really always doing well and rather clean and things like this. And, all this has just created a really bizarre things, and the landing obligation not being properly enforced, as you say, which is a total disgrace. I mean, if there's a definition of IUU, if you don't report it, then it's IUU, so yeah. But no, it was very useful, and your presentations as well, in terms of saying the policy is quite a good policy framework and it needs being implemented. So yeah, thanks a lot for the information. Thanks.
Thanks. We've got a question from Fiona Harvey, which is, Fiona's question is, what is the biggest danger in what the Commission may do to the CFP reform? So I guess, Fiona, you think that question is more like, what is the biggest danger of proposing a reform to the CFP? I'm going to slightly rephrase it in that sense, because I think that's perhaps what you meant. Vera, did you want to respond to that, or anyone else from any of the other NGOs?
Yeah, I'll have a first go, and maybe colleagues will want to complement. Thanks for the question, Fiona. So the biggest danger is that, as Andrea was explaining, if there were to be a reform right now, the conditions are not quite the same as they were in the last reform. And in particular, the position of the European Parliament is not as progressive these days as it was then. We do see that the Fisheries Committee in particular has recently adopted a number of positions that are contrary to the spirit and the letter of the CFP and of many other regulations. And this would not bode well for a reform that would rely heavily on the role of the Parliament as a co-legislator. we see that the member states have shown very little interest in implementing the ambition of the CFP as adopted in 2013. We also see a lot of industry pushback on some of the major progresses achieved in that reform, such as the MSY obligation and the landing obligation. So these would be the key issues that would then be at risk of being kind of taken out of the CFP if there was a reform at this stage and under these circumstances. But I see that Niels wants to complement that, so I'll pass the word to him.
Yeah, if I may. There are a lot of things to be said about risks or problems when we talk about EU legislation, of course. But I think that the one that's been mentioned several times that I would underline is that what we're actually facing is a legislation that has the tools. It has the links to the needed steps to be taken. For example, regarding the previous question on the landing obligation, that can be handled by the member states under regionalization. They can't act forcefully by not allowing certain members of their own fleets to fish in an environment if they can't deliver on, the landing obligation and so on. But on the CFP and the risks, we're sitting in a massive implementation deficit situation. To then spend the very limited resources and staff and expertise among the member states and in the Commission to just twist around a couple of words that in the end will not matter. It will not change the facts we're seeing at sea. I come from the Baltic region. We are the best example of, basically everything that can go wrong if you act too late. But it's not in a way the rules' fault or the fault of the rules. It's the actors involved. So I think our major issue with the whole thing is just a massively missed opportunity and waste of time and resource. Instead, we just need to go all in on what we have on the table and improve the current implementation. That's just in a nutshell kind of what we are frustrated and also afraid about if this would be opened up and become a big EU steamroller process.
And if I may make a last point, I think the time issue that Niels was highlighting is extremely important. The last CFP reform took 4, maybe even 5 years. It was announced at the very end of the Commission mandate in 2008 and then was taken up after the 2009 European elections, and it finished at the end of 2013. So it was really a long process of negotiation. In light of the multiple planetary crises that we have right now, spending the next 5 years, as Niels was saying, arguing about wording and kind of reframing objectives, but at the end of the day, I mean, it will again say we want sustainable fisheries without having the political will to take the necessary action to actually have sustainable fisheries. It's just going to be time that we don't have being spent in this process. What is really needed now is the political will to implement what is there, and that political will has not been apparent to date.
Thank you, Niels and Vera. Is there any other questions? And if you have a question on something that's not directly tied or for someone else, go ahead, Niels.
Yeah, if I just add something. I maybe we said someone of you and Vera and Andrea, you said this, but European Parliament's one actor. What about the other actor? I don't know. Maybe people are wondering about that. Where's the European Commission in this? What's their position? Where are they standing on? And also the member states. What could we add to this picture? We have an ambition or something brooding and sort of going on in the European Parliament. But what about the member states? What about the Commission? Could you reflect on that, Vera? Or Andrea?
Sure. If there are other questions, I'm happy to take them as well, but while we wait. Right now, the European Commission seems to be focused on implementation. They recognize that the full ambition of the CFP has not been reached and that implementation is the key gap. Having said that, they also realize that the framework as it is perhaps not fully comprehensive. One example is climate. right now the CFP is not is not adequate. It doesn't have the tools to integrate climate consideration in fisheries management. So what the Commission is doing right now is they are writing this report, which they are legally obliged to submit to the European Parliament and the Council by the end of the year. Their opinion, as publicly as expressed so far, is that this is a functioning report. It will focus on implementation. It will not trigger a reform. What they don't seem yet to be doing is to think of what other tools, instead of a reform, could they use to address the climate question and other implementation gaps. On the side of the Council, we don't really hear very loud voices at the moment openly asking for a reform, but we do know that the Council tends to also listen very closely to the interests of the fishing industry. So if there would be the opportunity for a reform, we would anticipate also strong support from many member states in Council for indeed weakening provisions related to the landing obligation, potentially to the MSY objective and others.
And Fiona has a follow-up question, which I think is an interesting one to reflect on, which is, has the UK's departure had an impact on this? And what effect will these developments have on the UK? I know that, Oceana, you are working on the UK as well as the EU, so you might want to comment on that, but others are also welcome to chime in. Yeah,
I'll give it a first go, and then I'm looking at my colleague Javier Lopez if he wants to complement on the UK side. The departure of the UK definitely plays a role. As Sophie was also mentioning earlier, there have been impacts in terms of quota allocations, quota swaps. There has been an impact on different fleet segments of the EU industry. So it is one more argument for those who would wish to see a reform to say the situation has changed. The UK is out. We need to kind of regroup, review our rules and see if any changes are necessary. Whether a reform in Europe would have an impact in the UK, I believe so, because it's a shared ecosystem. We're all fishing for the same resources. The UK is currently actively developing new fisheries legislation. And I think there is an interesting dynamic to be observed there in terms of what is the UK doing that the EU is paying attention to, and vice versa. So that would be an interesting space to observe. Niels, maybe you want to go next, and then I don't know, Javier, if you want to complement.
Yeah, I can do that while you prepare, Javier. I just want to bring in something that you perhaps didn't think of, Fiona, and that is actually, although I am active in the Baltic Sea region, the fishing companies we're talking about, the big actors, they are global. They are active everywhere. We have a big segment in the Baltic now, or basically the only segment that fish for some pelagic stocks, sprat and herring. And it's basically for fish meal. So for Scottish or Norwegian fish farms. They fish here in 1 month, maybe 3 weeks. Then they leave and they fish in Brexit waters, if I so may call them now. Meaning the Brexit and the negotiations and discussions of what's going on there has big impacts on these actors, therefore also their interest in the Baltic. So if they lose quota shares or abilities to fishing opportunities in wider terms, they will look elsewhere, meaning that the pressure in my region, but also in many other EU regions where the same companies and boats go at a different time of year, spreads this problem far beyond sort of Brexit areas, if you like. So it's actually it has a huge impact in that sense. And the second point, which I'm sure Javier will come to, and it's back to my original point, the amount of energy and time, the whole negotiation now between EU-Norway, EU-UK-Norway, EU, etc., is just eating away further on the implementation deficit problem that we have. We have few resources at hand to just manage this, and to open a reform now would only make it worse. But Javier, please.
Thank you. Yeah, so I will complement what Vera and Niels have already said. So my perception is as well that the UK's departure is having a huge impact, but not only in any potential new legislation that the European Union is going to develop, is that totally the governance system in the Northeast Atlantic has radically changed. So there is a new layer of complexity in all of this. And I'm totally sure that the European Union fishing sector is looking at the UK to explore what new domestic regulation the UK is adopting. And depending on the outcome of these decisions, it can have a direct impact on the European Union legislation. As Vera was pointed, the fish stocks are shared stocks. There is no exclusively UK stock. So most, if not all of the UK stocks are shared with the European Union. So we need as well to have shared management measures. It doesn't make sense to have different management standards in the European Union and the UK. So having any new regulation in the UK that undermines what the European Union has in the Common Fisheries Policy represent a risk to undermine the Common Fisheries Policy. So as I said, the European Union fishing sector, if realize that the UK is aiming to have lower standards, they are going to start suddenly to act to the European Union to lower these standards. So there is a significant interlink on what both parties are doing.
Thanks, Javier. I think it has also been discussed in the past, though, that equally, if the UK increases its standards, then that can have a positive effect on the EU in terms of it having to meet the same standards. So whilst we often do focus on the negative, there is a potential that that we might see an improvement if the UK chose to outperform. But as Javier said, it is certainly the entire process now is it feels even less transparent and is much more complicated in terms of the decision making with managing those different stocks. I am just going to ask if there is any other questions, because we've been going for 50 minutes and essentially this is intended as a fairly short, sharp briefing. So we don't want to continue just for the sake of it. So unless there are any other questions, then we will close the briefing and we will make the recording available so that if you missed parts of it, then you can rewatch it, and we'll circulate a link with that recording. Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, everybody. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions as well. You should have the email. Dave will send it around. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing.
Thank you. It was great.
Bye.